Hello everyone, welcome back to the shop. Today we're going to talk about hedge trimmer sharpening. First I'll go over the basic operation and function of a hedge trimmer and how they operate. Next we'll discuss what actually makes a hedge trimmer sharp and things that you should look for. Then I'll go ahead and demonstrate some of the methods and techniques that I use and that I've developed over the years of sharpening hedge trimmers and my thought process behind them. So if you're a homeowner, you're a landscaper, or you're a new mechanic getting into the field, I hope these tips and tricks will help you achieve a professional result. Enough jibber jabber, let's get after it. Okay, so first I'll go over the basic function of a hedge trimmer and how the blades operate. Here we have an Echo gearbox with no engine on it. It's just easier for me to turn. So inside this gearbox, you have the input, you have an input gear, and then you have another larger gear that two connecting rods are connected to that are connected to the blades. Think of it as basically like a crankshaft in a two-cylinder motorcycle, if you will. So as it rotates, it's basically just pulling the rods back and forth and the blades back and forth. Really simple, basic design. So as the blades rotate, or as the crankshaft rotates in there, and it pulls the blades forward and backwards. As you watch the blades come back, you have an upper blade and a lower blade. And as you watch this blade come back, you'll see it overlap the lower blade. So right there you have one cutting action, and then as it rotates forward, that same blade is going to move forward and bypass over the other forward tooth, and you have a second cutting action. So essentially each tooth is a double action cutting, if you will. Real simple, real basic, and this operates at very high RPM, so you can't really see it very well as it's happening. So that's the basic function of the blades themselves. So now let me show you exactly what makes a hedge trimmer dull. Okay, so basically you want to think of each of these individual teeth as nothing more than a pair of scissors. So what I mean by that is on a pair of scissors, you have two blades. You have this blade, it has an angle cut into it, and then you have the opposite blade that has an angle cut into it as well. And then on the back side of the blades, it's perfectly flat on this one and on this one as well. So this is called a bypass cutter, if you will. So these two blades, as they bypass each other, they create a cutting action. And that's what makes them sharp. A hedge trimmer is nothing more than the same thing. So as you have your lower blade, you have your upper blade, and then as they go back and forth, they bypass each other, creating your cutting action. So what makes the hedge trimmer dull, is I'll go back to the scissors, is if you were to take this pair of scissors and you have an angle cut on this side, and then of course your angle cut on this side. If you were to take this side, the flat side of the blade, and you were to cut that same angle into the flat side of the blade, what would happen is you would have a gap between the two blades, and then it would not function properly and it wouldn't cut. So that's essentially what's happening with a hedge trimmer. As the hedge trimmer gets worn, the flat side of the blade, the leading edge, these edges will round off, and then the opposite blade, the upper blade, will do the exact same thing. So you have a round edge on the top one, you have a round edge on the bottom one. That creates a little tiny gap in the blade, and that's what makes it dull and not cut properly. So let me bring you in a little closer, and then I'll go ahead and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so on this hedge trimmer here, this one is dull, needs to be sharpened. So what you're going to look at on these blades, try to get it to where the camera can get it, the right angle here, is you're going to look at the leading edge of these blades, and you can see just that little bit of roundness on the front edge of the blade. It looks like it's rounded right here. Each one of these blades will show that. Here's a good example of one right here. So when you have this front edge rounded, and then the opposite blade, the bypass side, does the same thing on the other side of the blade, if you will, that's as they contact each other, that is creating a gap between the two blades, and that's affecting your cutting. So when you look at a set of blades, to see how dull they are, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at that front edge on the flat side. Don't worry about the angle side. Now here I have a set of brand new blades on this unit, and you can see how dead flat that edge is. Perfectly flat. The blades are perfectly flat to each other, and then you have a nice edge and a nice angle cut into each blade. So as they bypass each other, again, they're just like scissors, razor sharp. So it's very important that when you're sharpening these, you never want to touch the flat side of the blade. Now occasionally I'll get them in here where there's some damage, where they may have hit a piece of wire, really, piece of metal or something like that, and it damages the blade, and you have to take a little Dremel and just kind of knock it back down flat again. That's something that does happen. But as you're sharpening these, you never want to touch the flat side. Same thing with a pair of scissors. You only want to sharpen the one side of the scissors. Other things to consider as well that can affect how the blades cut is, as the plant material builds up on the bar and on the blades themselves, what can happen over time is that plant material can get in between the blades and build up enough to where it'll separate the blades. And again, your goal is to have those blades perfectly flat on top of each other. So over time, that material can build up, and you may need to take the blades apart to clean the flat side of the blade and clean the surfaces to get them back down flat again. Another thing is sometimes people will loosen the bar bolts, and again, that just creates a bigger gap in the blades. That allows that plant material to get in between the blades easier to build up, thus creating a gap, affecting your cutting. Most of the hedge trimmers nowadays you cannot adjust. What it is there is a bolt that goes straight through here, and underneath this washer is a little tiny spacer that determines the gap between the blades. Then that bolt just goes straight through, and you lock down the nut, clamp it all down tight. You can't adjust it. So most of these newer style, even the electric hedge trimmers, are all going to this style of blade bolt. They should all be tight all the time. Echoes, on the other hand, you can adjust manually because the bar itself is threaded. So you loosen the nut, you tighten the bolt up to the desired tension that you want, and then you lock down the lock nut. So they still do it that way. I think there's a couple others I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, but so there are some out there that you can adjust, but for the most part, you cannot adjust them anymore. So you want to make sure your blades are adjusted properly as well, because that can affect things too. You may have a sharp set of blades, but if the blades are loose or there's a lot of material built up between, that can affect your cutting because they're not perfectly flat to one another, just like a pair of scissors. So that is something to be aware of. So now let's talk about the tools that you'll need to sharpen the hedge trimmer. There's 100 different ways you can do this. You can use a file and do it by hand. You can use a Dremel, numerous types of grinders, air tools. There's 100 different ways to do it. It's kind of up to you. Whatever you're comfortable using, it doesn't matter. The end result is the same, a sharp pair of hedge trimmers. So I use a Milwaukee. This happens to be a 4.5-inch grinder. This is what I find. It removes material fast for me, and it's effective. I don't have to worry about batteries or whatnot. Works very well. Now, as far as the wheels are concerned, you can use anything from the standard old steel disc here, steel cutting disc. You can use a flap disc if you want to. I don't use these, and I'll explain why. But these do work as well. Lately, we've been using these. These are a new wheel that we found. It's a synthetic design, super thin, and they work really well. They don't clog up really bad with plant material. They're very effective. Another thing I have here as well is a stone dresser, if you will, or a wheel dresser. This one's worn down pretty good, but basically it just has a bunch of really sharp metal teeth on here. So as you're cutting, you put this in contact with the blade as it's rotating, and that dresses the wheel and cleans it. So if you get a lot of plant material that's built up on the surface of the cutting wheel, that tool there will clean that off. So that's the basics of what I use. And again, use whatever you're comfortable with. So before I start getting into the sharpening aspect of it, another thing to consider that you have to make the decision on as far as before you sharpen is taking the blades apart. You'll see a lot of guys take these things apart to clean the blades. There are times where you may have to do that. A lot of cases anymore, we don't anymore. We used to. Back in the 80s and 90s, we would take every single hedge trimmer apart and we would clean the blades and put them back together. But over time, we just figured out that it really wasn't worth the time and effort. Especially, this one is a tiny bit of buildup on the blades. It's really not bad at all. There's nothing to worry about there. There are times, though, when these things get, again, like I said earlier, when they get a lot of buildup on the blades. During certain times of the year here in Arizona, we will see that. And I will have to take them apart, and I will have to clean them because there's just too much buildup. I cannot get the blades flat enough. But largely, for the most part, you won't have to take them apart. It might be easier for you to take them apart and clamp them to the edge of a bench or whatever. If you need to do that, that's fine. Whichever way works for you. I'll show you exactly how I clamp this thing down and what we use before sharpening. So as far as clamping it down, what I use here is a park tool. This is actually a bicycle clamp. These things work extremely well for holding hedge trimmers, weed eaters. I have it set up here on the corner of my bench, so when I have a weed eater or extended hedge trimmer, I can clamp that tube right into place, holds it in line, put the engine down there, I can work on it. Works perfectly. These things are great. Very simple design. I think they're a few $100. They're not terribly expensive. So if you don't need one from day to day, it might be a little much, but they're worth the investment if you're doing this stuff quite a bit. They're just a great, simple little tool. So let me clamp this hedge trimmer in here real quick. I'll show you. Okay, so before I clamp this hedge trimmer in the clamp, what I want to do is I want to set these blades up at what I'll call a 50% overlap. So what I'll do, I'll just rotate these blades until they're exactly like that. So you can see they're about 50% overlap. What that allows me to do, it allows me to sharpen all of these on this side, and then on this side, and then I'll flip it over and I'll do the same thing. And then I'll go ahead, once I've done all those, I'll rotate it back the other way, about 50% overlap, and then I'll do it, repeat and do it again. So now let me clamp this thing in the vise. Real simple. I just put it on the leading edge of this clamp, and then you clamp it down. Nice and solid. These things you can adjust the tension right here. Just adjust this wheel to give you more or less tension. And that's it. Rotate it around. You can see it clamped in there. Real simple. Holds it nice and tight. I don't have to worry about it moving around or falling out. Okay, now that I have it clamped in the vise, let me talk about technique. So with these hedge trimmers, the leading edge of the hedge trimmers are the fronts. These blades up here, they take the most abuse. These are the ones that are getting stuck into the ground. They're the first things usually to hit the plant. So they take a beating. So they are usually going to be the dullest of all of them. As you get closer up towards the gear head, there's less and less wear, especially on a handheld. This is an extended hedge trimmer attachment. Same applies with these for the most part. So as you travel forward on the blade, they just get worse and worse and worse. So this front edge of the blade takes a beating. And these blades will usually be the dullest, of course, and you will have to take more material off of these blades to make them sharp than you will the blades closer to the gear head. So that's something to be aware of. So if people are not sharpening these things on a regular basis and they're just using them over and over again and they're super dull, the duller they are, the more material that I have to take off to make these things sharp again. So you don't want to wait too long or let them get extremely dull. Otherwise, you'll have to take more material. So you can see how thin that blade is, how much material has been taken off of these blades versus these blades back here. Less material has been taken off because they don't get as dull. So if you stay on top of your sharpening, you don't let it get too far, then you don't have to remove as much material when you sharpen them. Now, when I start sharpening, I like to start in the front. I start in the nose of the hedge trimmer. Usually because these blades are thinner, they cannot handle as much heat. So what I do is I start in the front, I'll start grinding, I'll move my way down, and then what I'll do is I'll flip and I'll come back to the front. If it needs more material, by the time I get back up here, the blade will have cooled off enough that I can take a little bit more material off if necessary. Sometimes you cannot take off enough material without putting too much heat in the blade in the first shot. So you may have to grind a little bit, go to the next one, go down the line, finish your line, and then go back. And then by the time you get back up here, they're cooled off enough that you can go ahead and continue. So that's why I start in the front, because they take the biggest beating and they usually need the most material taken off. I can start in the front, work my way down. By the time I get down to the end, the front is cooled off enough I can go back to it if I need to. So that is one technique. Next would be the angle of the grinder. So again, my goal is to take that roundness off of the edge of that blade. So what I do when I start sharpening these is I will come in here at more of a vertical angle. Then I'll go ahead, angle it back to give it my finished edge, to match the factory edge. So I'll come in more flat. What that's doing is it's taking off that rounded edge. Then I'll go ahead and angle it back and then give it the pretty edge. See if I can show you with the grinder itself here. So I'll come in with it being a little more vertical like this. Then I'll kick it back and give it the angle. So when you're coming in a little bit more vertical, you don't have to be 100% vertical. Just a little bit. You can, just enough to take that rounded edge off, then kick it back to give it the pretty edge. And it's so subtle when I'm doing it, you almost can't see it. It's just, just enough to take that rounded edge off, because that's my goal. My goal is to remove that rounded edge first. That's my number one priority. And then I'll go ahead and make it pretty and make the angle match the factory angle. So let me get this camera set up and get this to where I can hopefully show you and demonstrate exactly what I do. Okay, I'm ready to go here. So what I'll do is you'll see me, I'll come in, I'll be a little more vertical. I'll lay it down and then do the pretty edge. And I'll come in, again, trying to remove that round spot, lay it back, I'll go down the line. So as you can see, I kind of came in a little more vertical, laid it back. So what that does is that's taken off that rounded edge first, and then I'm giving it the pretty edge and the angle. So another thing to be aware of as you're doing this is heat. You do not want to put too much heat into these blades. These blades are hardened and tempered, so if you turn the tips of these blades blue, basically you're taking the temper out of the steel, and they essentially will not stay sharp as long. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of blueness to them. When they get this thin, the tips of them, sometimes it's hard to avoid. So again, that's another reason why I start at the front. I do a little bit, go down the line, let it cool, then I'll come back. So I'm not putting too much heat into the blades themselves. So let me throw this thing on the bench and then I'll give you an example. Okay, here's the blade that I just did. And you can see the edges here. So what you're doing, as I flip this over, you can see how nice and flat they are again compared to the other side. You see that rounded edge on this side, nice and flat on this side. And you'll get a little bit of steel that will kind of flake off too, that bird edge, if you will. So you can see the difference between the rounded edge and the nice crisp flat edge. You don't need to touch this side. Once it's done, it's done. You don't need to take a file and try to clean that off, because once you run the machine, basically it'll take all that off of it and it doesn't affect the blade. It won't hurt it. So now when I'm talking about the heat, I just did this as an example on this blade. This is an old attachment. So what I did here was I just put excessive heat. You can see how the tip of this thing is blue. That's what you do not want. You do not want to turn these blue at all, if at all possible. Every once in a while it happens. I mean, when they get this thin, this is really thin. It's really hard. That heat's got to go somewhere. So, you don't want to put too much pressure on it. Just light pressure, the weight of the machine, basically, if you're using a grinder like I am. And just let the tool do the work. Don't put too much force into it at all. So that's what you're trying to avoid, is turning them blue. You just want to give it a nice clean edge. You'll see that little bit of flaking, see that metal flaking off of the edge. As you're sharpening, you can see it there as well. As you're sharpening, you can actually see that happening. It'll come out and you'll see it. Once you see that happening, most of the time you've eliminated that round edge on the blade, and you'll be good to go, and it'll be sharp. But again, it just depends on how round these blades are and how dull they are. That'll determine how much material you're going to have to take off. And again, that's why I come in here more of a vertical angle, because I want to take that rounded edge off first and then go ahead, lay it back, and give it the angle. So those are just some of the techniques that I've developed over the years. Just be smooth with the grinder. Get into a rhythm with it. Don't overthink it too much. It's not real complicated. It's real simple stuff. So again, Avoid the bluing if you can, avoid the heat. That's why, again, why I start at the front, work my way down. Then by the time I get back up here, it's cool enough I can hit it again if I need to. So I'll chuck this thing back up and I'll just go ahead and I'll run through the whole cycle of doing this for you. All right, so I'll just go ahead and I'll finish this side off, and then I'll flip it over and I'll do the back side, and I'll just show you the one side, and so you get the idea. I won't go through the entire hedge trimmer. Okay, so here's the finished edge of the one I just did. Just see nice and even. It takes time and practice just to get them perfectly even. Don't worry about it too much. You can see the angle. You want to try to mimic the factory angle as much as possible down the line. And now the front one up here, it got hot on me. It happens really fast. When these things get that thin, it doesn't take much to get a little bit of heat. That little bit is fine. It's not going to make or break it. So don't worry about it too much if you do get a little bit of heat transfer in there. It happens. But when the blades are, newer and they're nice and thick like that, you want to make sure that you're not bluing them, making sure you're not putting too much heat into them. So just practice with it. Take your time. Go nice and slow at first. Not too much pressure. Just watching that heat. If that blade looks like it's starting to turn blue, get off of it. Let it cool. Then go back to it. Now here's the back side of that same blade. I just flipped it over. And you can see that round edge is gone. And that's your goal, is to eliminate that round edge. So one other thing I'll discuss on this unit here, when you have a complete unit, is the grinding wheels and why I don't use the flap discs. A lot of times I like to use the top side. I'll remove this paper, and I grind on both sides of this wheel. I use both ends. On a flap disc, you can't do that. And the reason I do that is when I'm sharpening, I like to flip it over upside down when I'm going down this line. So when the blade is over on the other side, you can go like this. But then in this case, you flip it over, and I like to do it upside down like this. And you go down the line. So if you try to use a flap disc, it's only one-sided. And as you go down the line, you get closer to the handle. You can't quite get in there towards the end to get the proper angle. So that's why I like to flip it over like this as you get closer to the engine side of the unit. And I utilize both sides of the wheel. With a flap disc, you just can't do that. You can not sharpen the ones up here if you're just using a flap disc. You can go ahead and just skip that one at the end. It really doesn't matter. The closer they are to the handle, they're not doing a lot of cutting anyway for the most part. Not as much as the front half anyway. So that's the reason I don't use flap discs. So that works well for me, and that's just something that you got to experiment with. You know, it takes a little bit of practice to get used to a grinder upside down like this as well. So what I'll do now is I put this hedge trimmer attachment back in the vise. I'll go ahead and I'll demonstrate the grinder upside down method. There you have it, my tips and tricks for sharpening a hedge trimmer. I hope these will help you achieve a professional result with your equipment. Also, you may be able to go to a local shop, pick up a used one of these that they are recycling or throwing away, and you could bring it home and practice. Again, it's all about practice, practice, practice. Take your time, don't overthink it, and you'll achieve professional results every time. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.